So I will start off today by saying good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Talia. I'm the Virtual Experiences Coordinator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and I am so excited to get to be the voice of the audience today. So my role in this program is to pull the questions, the comments, the queries, your reactions, whatever you have to share with our experts today. It is my job to pull those from the chat and share that with our audience, or not with our audience, with our experts, and share that, I guess, with the audience as well. So keep sending your questions, your comments, your reactions, your thoughts to all of this stuff in the chat throughout the event today. I will be watching and I will be ready to bring your questions to the experts closer to the end of our program today. I'm going to have all of our panelists, all of our experts start their webcams and give everybody a big wave. We have several people from the fields of water, fields of energy, of engineering, from oil and gas. We have lots of different perspectives represented today. And you know what? That's the whole point, is what we really want this event to be is we want it to feel like we're all sort of sitting around in the living room and having a discussion about some of these really important issues, and not just about water and not just about energy separately, but about how they intersect. We're really interested in the intersection of the two and how they overlap and how they shape policy, lives, I don't know, just the way that we think about water and energy here in our state of Colorado. That's really our goal today. So a couple of quick housekeeping items before I hand it over. As I said, please do send any messages, comments, questions that you have in the chat. We are watching that chat the entire time, and we do have it set so that you are not seeing each other's messages, but we are still seeing them. So send those at any time. And our icebreaker question for the day was, what watershed, goodness gracious. What watershed were you born in, and what watershed are you watching from today? So pop that in the chat. We are watching. It's always great to get to hear that from all of you. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patty Limerick, who is the former state historian and the director of the Center for the American West at CU Boulder. She is going to take you through a little bit of what today's program is going to look like. We're doing this a little differently than we did last week, and she will also introduce our panelists. So Patty, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back here. Yes, it is another Rockmount shirt, in case you were wondering. And if anybody knows Steve Weil at Rockmount, tell him that I can go. Well, I've been wearing a different Rockmount shirt every time, and I can go for probably 6 more sessions if we were to have them, because they are the best. Sorry to any other product line, but they are the best. So, and I am wearing Western wear, and this time I'm going to skip the part where I show you that I'm wearing cowboy boots, because really, who needs that? We don't have to go into that territory. So, as everyone knows, we were planning an in-person event, and then the world was transformed. And so we thank you for your adaptability and for joining us in this mode. I actually have found this quite satisfying and engaging myself as a form of communication in ways I might not have expected before. For those, well, I want to make sure that I thank our team from the Colorado Scientific Society who envisioned this event and made it happen. And those are past presidents and former presidents, current president Jim Paces and Tom Casadevall, former president, and most of all, Bob Reynolds, who really pulled this together and got all these good speakers assembled for us. I'd also like to thank the folks from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, Jessa Phillips and Talia Farnsworth. And I want to thank my comrades from the Center of the American West, Kurt Gutyar, Honey Aschenbrenner, and Lisa Cooper, and Shelby Litton, recent CU graduate in geosciences, highly employable, just out of college, really, someone you want to have on your team. I can tell you that, having had her on my team. And there's one more session coming, so tell your friends. Now, we are changing our format, because this is the magic moment halfway through the program, the 4-part program for 2 weeks, where we have the foundations in place to now put the accent on the relationships between energy and water and to engage them in the same process of thinking. Running continuously, excuse me, through this enterprise is a focus on science and technology and human decision-making as we take on those 2 important subjects of energy and water. That has been central to all the sessions. Engineering and technology are featured in a good share of the discussion today, and I'm pleased to see that our panel is 50% engineers. That's pretty cool. And for all I know, some of the people who are not engineers, 2 of them might be married engineers or be parents of engineers. So I think we have got a good demographic cohort here of the profession. And that gives me the occasion to remind people, some have heard this already, I guess, but this was the Limerick rule I used to put out before 2020, which is that engineering is so crucial for our contemporary assumptions about life and how we live that before 2020, I used to say and I hope that the engineers on the panel will like this, that no dinner party was complete until you had invited an engineer, because you needed someone to explain how things were working, why the lights were on, why there was water, how food had been produced and transported, and so on. Now that has been modified for the times, so Limerick's rule updated: no Zoom cocktail hour is complete until you have invited an engineer. And that, because of surveillance methods of our times, could be enforced. Some people could be snooped upon and made sure that there really is such a person represented. So engineers are going to be really in demand. Prepare for that, engineers. Then I do have a limerick. It's the only limerick that we're going to have today. Well, we'll wait a moment on that. Okay, that's a pretty good one, about engineers and our relationship to them. Though we would never want to be catty, engineers have made nature ratty. As they fill all our needs, we bombard them with screeds, which for some reason drives them all batty. So that's not, of course, my opinion, but that is my summation of what I think our attitudes are. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I should explain that for time control, I didn't know what to do exactly on Zoom if somebody gets, as these people are all deserve to do, get excited and enthusiastic and want to keep chatting. If they are coming pretty close to the time limit for their remarks, I will put on the white hat because I do want to be a good guy. And then if for some reason the problem doesn't get resolved, then we go for the black hat. And so very effective. I recommend it. I will use it when we get back to in-person meeting, I think, whenever we do that. So I'd also like to say that this series represents a great moment in human civilization, which is an ending of the war between humanities and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. In universities, we have just locked into a sorrowful state of thinking this is the war that we are in. There's the humanities on one side of campus, there's STEM on the other side, we're at war. That's over. Can't afford that. There's too much at stake in the collaboration between STEM and humanities. So this program is a launching of the recognition that we are now in a state of armistice. There is a peace negotiated between STEM and humanities because it's just too important. The best technology imaginable still has to go out in the world and deal with human attitudes, human cultures, and so on. So just obvious reasons why we are now launching that. If anyone wants to engage in planning future celebrations of the armistice, the peace treaty between STEM and humanities, please contact me and we'll get to work on some more events. But this occasion is really a great one for that. So we have changed our format. Instead of 10-minute opening statements, we have shifted now to having much briefer opening statements where the panelists will say, I'll introduce them, but they will say a bit about their own background that brings them to participate in today's session. And they will just give us a sense of why they wanted to be in a conversation on energy and water. So we'll have 5 minutes or 5 or 6 minutes from each panelist. Then we have prepared questions and we will go into interaction. The prepared questions all bring energy and water together in the same moment of consideration. That does not mean that the panelists abandon their expertise in possibly either in water or in energy, but that they launch from that base into this joined conversation on those two topics. The panelists don't know yet, that's a great surprise, what order they'll be giving their opening remarks. Forgot to tell you that. So we start with my favorite form of order in the world, alphabetical order, but we start and then we abandon that. So Tom Check will be first, and then Christy Woodward, we leap to the other side of the alphabet. Christy will be second, Tracy Kosloff will be third, and Seth Haynes will be fourth. So sorry for not telling you that beforehand, folks, but you're adaptable. So our first speaker is Tom Check. He currently serves as the co-director of the One World, One Water, oh wow, pronounced right, I hope there, Center for Urban Water Education and Stewardship at Metro State University in Denver. He was born and raised on a farm in Nebraska. Agriculture keeps coming up in our discussions, and now we have someone formed and shaped by that. In his years as the executive director of the Central Colorado Water Conservancy District in Greeley, he became one of our region's most thoughtful commentators on the issues of water management. So his relocation into the world of higher education in Colorado has been a very valuable development for us all. In the big picture of water education in the state, there's really nobody better to spend time with. So here we have Tom Check.
Thank you. That's so kind, Patty. So it's exciting to be here. I'm the co-director of the One World, One Water Center at Metropolitan State University of Denver. And what that is, started 10 years ago. It's a program to create a water studies minor or certificate for any academic major at the university. And we have about 20,000 students that attend Metro State. And what's been really fun about this job, just a pleasure, has been working with the students and faculty, and then working with such a wide range of academic departments to help people learn about the basics about water in Colorado and the West and around the world. We have classes of water law, Colorado water law, and so forth. And we have students majoring in history, anthropology, engineering, the sciences, biology, but even in art and teacher education that are passionate about becoming water stewards, and they want to learn more about this. One of the reasons I'm excited to be on this panel is we're going to start a program at Auraria looking at the water energy nexus on our campus. And so the first hurdle to get over, what is the water energy nexus? And if I'm a student, faculty, or staff member on that campus, how in the world does that connection affect me? And then secondly, what can I do to reduce my water energy use, knowing that one has a positive or negative effect on the other? So that's one of the really interesting things about this panel for me today. And then finally, I grew up on a farm in Nebraska, and we used wind power to get our water on the farm, a windmill. And it's interesting, if you go back generationally and so forth, some of the old ways that things were done in terms of water energy were quite sustainable. Didn't have air conditioning or those sorts of things, but let me tell you that the first day we were able to have air conditioning, we sure put it in, because some of the old ways are not that pleasurable or enjoyable. And that's the struggle we have, is how do we use all these modern conveniences we have today that rely on water energy, and at the same time be good stewards of water and energy consumption. I'll stop there.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Tom. That was really interesting. The windmills of yore, a really great point of reference for us and many other parts there. So our next speaker is Christy Woodward. She serves as the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs for the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. She leads COGA's regulatory strategy. Before joining Colorado Oil and Gas Association, Christy brought with her to COGA 2 decades of experience in civil and environmental engineering, design, and project management, including working on the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act permitting and compliance, as well as wildlife and cultural assessments for energy projects on federal lands. Kind of training for this panel, really, in these 20 years or so. So here's Christy Woodward.
Thank you so much, Patty, for having me, and thank you to the Museum of Nature and Science. Can you guys hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, thank you. I got a double reminder to unmute. I'm sorry for that. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. I think I came to this panel with a recognition that I am an engineer by training, but interestingly enough, I do now a lot of public policy, a lot of regulatory work, a lot of stakeholder outreach. You know, one of the things that we strive to do at COGA is education and outreach, but also work with unconventional stakeholders. And so I'm really excited to be here today from that perspective. I also wanted to share with folks a number of rulemakings that happened recently in Colorado. One, to advance our regulations around wellbore integrity for groundwater protections, giving Colorado some of the most stringent groundwater protection rules for the oil and gas industry in the country. We work closely with environmental stakeholders on that rule and regulation, as well as local governments, and ultimately kind of came to a consensus on it, which is something that we desire to do at all junctures, and something we're really, really proud of. Another thing that we do is speak ways to conserve water in our operations, in fracking operations and drilling operations, and not only conservation, but also reuse and recycling. Another recent rulemaking that happened in Colorado is a Water Quality Control Commission regulation around Reg 84 that modified that rule to allow for the use of claimed water in fracking operations in Colorado that had previously been prohibited. And so we at COGA, again, continually sort of want to try to find ways to have some of these crucial conversations around water in the West, and look to some of our counterparts in other states who can recycle up to 80% or more of their water, have clean discharge of produced water, et cetera. And so I'm happy to be here today, and I'll end with that and look forward to more discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Christy. Now we're going to move to Tracy Kosloff, who is Deputy State Engineer with the Colorado Division of Water Resources. Before joining that division in 2010, she worked as a consulting engineer in the water supply planning field before joining that division in 2010. Now she plays a statewide role. This is quite a portfolio of responsibility here. A statewide role dealing with well permitting, surface water, use approvals, state legislation, water law, and, in case we left anything out, whatever else is necessary. So here is Tracy Kosloff.
Thanks, Patty. Thanks for that really nice introduction. So I am another one of the engineers on the panel. And I was recruited to be on this panel because I used to work with somebody at the Division of Water Resources who was in touch with Bob Reynolds, one of the organizers of this event, and so suggested that I be here on the panel. And I happily accepted the invitation because as someone who works at the Division of Water Resources, I think it's good that we be part of discussions about water and energy in Colorado. Also, any event where Patty Limerick is going to be the Master of Ceremonies is something that I'd like to be a part of. I just think she's really great at helping us think differently about things. And so I thank you, Patty, for being such a big part of this program. So at the Division of Water Resources, we're a part of the Department of Natural Resources for the state of Colorado, and we have a couple of jobs that we do related to water. One is that we distribute water according to Colorado's system of priority water rights. And we also hold much of the data related to stream flows and water usage. So both of those duties, enforcing the rules about using water and holding the data about stream flows and water usage, are important. And I think they're relevant to the topic about water and energy. For instance, it can help us answer the question about how much water is actually diverted in Colorado for use to supply water for energy. I also wanted to point out that there are 2 water agencies in the state of Colorado, and that can often be confusing for people. Both these water agencies are part of the Department of Natural Resources. So there's the Division of Water Resources where I work, and also the Colorado Water Conservation Board. The Colorado Water Conservation Board is the planning agency. And so that agency looks at stressors on our water supply, and they try to come up with plans for our future water supply. And so on Thursday, there's going to be a member of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. One of the staff members, Russ Sands, is going to be on the panel. And so he'll be talking about the state's role in terms of planning for Colorado's water future around energy on Thursday's panel. So just to wrap up, at the Division of Water Resources, we implement the law and we hold the data about water in Colorado. Implementing the law sometimes means that we can be a wet blanket when people are trying to come up with creative ideas for solving Colorado's water problems. We're a wet blanket because we know a lot of the details about Colorado water law, and so when ideas are proposed that simply aren't legal, we're the folks that say, that sounds like a good idea, but that doesn't work within the legal framework that we have. But this panel, and in a lot of other ways, we don't want to be that wet blanket. We'd rather be the folks who know a lot about water law and water administration. And with that, we can try to come up with creative solutions that do work within our system of water law. And so, again, I'm happy to be on the panel, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Sadly, this has really set off an ambition in me that I didn't know was there, that now I want to drop everything and write a history of wet blankets in Western history, because I just think we have not paid enough attention. And it's easy to think, oh man, they just get in the way. But in fact, they're they're often giving us cautionary remarks that we should take to mind. So look forward to Patricia Nelson Limerick's forthcoming The Wet Blanket in History. And
Patty,
yeah.
there's a good water pun in there, you know, wet blanket. Yeah,
I was going to say a soggy history. I was going to say that, but what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just saying, you know, it's a wet blanket, so obviously there's some water involved.
I missed the initial wet. Okay, really alert this morning. Thank you so much. That's really great. Okay, moving now to Seth Haynes. He is a research geophysicist with the USGS Central Energy Resources Science Center in Denver. Interesting that he went to college and graduate school in California, and one wonders if he is really, really happy. Well, we assume he's really, really happy not to be in California at this point in time and to be in Maine, in the woods of Maine instead, and also to live in Colorado when he's not in Maine. So his work centers on using seismic and other geophysical methods and quantifying the potential effects of oil and gas development on water resources and wildlife habitat, a topic that's already come up in a comment or two. This work includes analysis of data related to hydraulic fracturing and water production. So here is Dr. Seth Haynes.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Patty, and thanks, Dr. Bob and all, for the chance to be part of this panel. I did want to take this moment to share a couple of slides and set the stage for some of what I'm going to be saying. I'm not sure why that's not... Hopefully you're seeing my title slide. So the main thing I think I bring to this conversation is data, and so I wanted to take this chance to show a few things. Water, of course, is used throughout the oil and gas development process, and I look at a lot of these data, so I thought I would set the stage a little bit. There's water used for drilling and cement, water used for hydraulic fracturing, water is produced along with oil and gas. And for some reason, these discussions seem to be quite polarized. So I think it's often worthwhile to look at some data, because I would posit that if we want to be making good decisions about the future, we should perhaps be also learning from the past and the present. But worth asking and questioning, who is this guy and why am I talking at you? And I appreciate Patty's introduction. Just to build slightly on that, I'll say that I'm a research geophysicist. As noted, I'm in the energy part of the U.S. Geological Survey, which has some importance here. USGS provides objective scientific information for the nation, and we only do science. We have zero regulatory role, which for me at least is a great position to be in. And the focus is on is on resource management and federal land use decisions, but it extends much more broadly. There's a wide variety of science in the USGS. A couple of key parts of this, although my background is honestly pretty evenly split between energy and water, I am sitting in the energy part of the USGS, so working with data on that side of things. I work quite a lot with people in water and other branches of the USGS. And I would say also that the USGS in this scientific information thing provides a lot of work relating to energy and water, and a lot of that I'm less familiar with, of course, than my own. So let's just look very quickly at some data. First, where is there oil and gas development in Colorado? This map shows wells across the state in a few major clusters, perhaps you would notice, mostly not in the mountains. That's not where oil and gas tends to be. We have the Denver Basin, well located near Denver, Piceance Basin in the west, the San Juan and Raton Basins in the south, and other development elsewhere. When has this been happening? Well, since the early 1900s, but with a burst perhaps in the 2000s. How much water is involved? Well, this plot here shows the total water used for hydraulic fracturing per year in the state of Colorado, and we can see again a bit of a bump in recent years. How much water per well? This plot shows us how much water has been used per well based on actual reported numbers, so that each box and whisker there represents the distribution of water used in each well in that year. So you can see about 7 million gallons as a median value in 2018. How much water has been produced every year? That's another key piece of the puzzle, right? So this plot shows total water production per year. There's a funny jump on the oil line, which I assume is a data problem or a reporting problem. Nonetheless, we got some numbers here, something to think about. So what are those numbers? So I've switched now from gallons and barrels in the previous plots, or I guess all gallons, to acre feet. So 34,000 gallons, or acre feet, sorry, of water per year, roughly in recent years, as compared to water production of 6,000 acre feet. Sounds big, I guess. I don't know. What does that even mean? I think it doesn't mean a whole lot unless we compare it with something or think about what exists otherwise. So some useful numbers are that agriculture in Colorado uses about 4.7 million acre feet per year, and municipal use is considerably smaller than ag, but still a pretty large number of 371,000 acre feet. So at least there's something to compare against. And this isn't to say that anything is or is not a problem, just some numbers that we can compare. And I think a really key point here, though, which Tracy can probably expand upon a lot better than I can, is that these waters are not readily interchangeable. Laws and logistics make that pretty complicated. So with that, I guess I will sign off. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, panelists. What a spectacular engineering of time you all engaged in. That was really something to see. I don't know that I've been a moderator for thousands of events, and I have never seen people so compliant with time. And so I will never want to be on a panel with anybody except you guys, because you say a lot and you say it so effectively, and you conclude. So now I'm talking too long about that and taking up too much time. So now we are really, really set to get going on some valuable and interesting questions. And I think I'm going to start, I think I'm going to ask Tom, because he was our first presenter, to take on our first question that all the panelists, by the way, have seen these questions and had a chance to think about them. So nobody is going to be blindsided, except maybe Tom is blindsided because I just called on him to start us off. So I think we need to shift the main screen here so that we can see someone besides the name of one person. Anyway, so Tom, could you start us off with your thoughts on identifying one or two significant problems that you think we would be better able to resolve if water experts and energy experts were really joined together in a common enterprise? So you notice that's quite a easy question, because it's only one or two, and one is, you could just go with one, and then we can pass it on to somebody else. So whatever you'd like to do with that.
We'll start with one, and I think what starts with population growth in our state, and that leads to awareness. And all of us that are involved in water or energy and spend a lot of our professional careers on that are pretty aware of a lot of the issues involved in water conservation, water stewardship, energy, so forth. But when you start talking to folks that don't do this for a living, they don't work in water or energy, and the only news they get is from online sources or whatever, and you don't know what is true or not true, how do we get out clear, honest, accurate information that the general public will actually, first of all, read or look at, and then second, contemplate and maybe even tend to believe? So I'll start off with awareness. To me, is the biggest thing for the general public to learn more about the basics of water and energy use in our state, and that connectivity of the two, and how can engineers and policymakers and scientists have activities that help improve awareness with the general public.
So, and I'm going to press you just a little bit on that one. How is it that would be made more effective or even easier if you joined energy and water in that campaign, as opposed to maybe it would make it harder if you had the two topics together? So,
well, and that's a great question, because at the Auraria campus, we're open to do the Water Energy Nexus project in the coming year, where we're going to look at water and energy conservation and how the two are interact with one another. What you do with water affects energy and vice versa. Not just on the campus, but when you go home, to start thinking about the two together. I say I conserve water, I conserve energy. Well, how does that kind of mesh? I recycle. Well, how does that help the water energy nexus? So it's kind of a new way of thinking that it kind of makes your head hurt a little bit. Where is that connection, and how does it affect me in my daily life and in my pocketbook?
Really interesting. Christy, I'm going to ask you to come in on this one. And actually, it connects very closely to another one of the questions that we have up before us. If, in fact, it pretty much is that question. If we launch from this premise that consumers are awakening how much they depend on steady supplies of water and energy, and that rests on my own conviction that over the last 25 or 30 years being out in the world and talking to public audiences, there really is a significant increase in consciousness that water and energy don't just magically appear, that there is something that happens for us to get that. So if we are seeing some acceleration in awareness, what are the best ways to accelerate that expansion of awareness, and how does what Tom was speaking of how to bring attention to both energy and water, how does that actually push that acceleration and make it of awareness of our dependence on water and energy and make it more lasting? Yeah. So taking off where Tom was and then going particularly to the lasting part.
Yeah, that's perfect, Patty, and I appreciate that. And I'm happy to hear that there is sort of this awakening and awareness around where our energy comes from and where our water comes from, and just how important those resources are and how precious they are. I think, from the perspective of oil and gas, it's a difficult thing to talk about technology and innovation in a way that's meaningful and digestible for people. And so I think really that conversion of STEM and humanities that you mentioned earlier is really, really a critical piece to the success of that. I think being able to have a really important conversation about energy, where it comes from, really educating people that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution, we need it all, is important. And then I think understanding how that converges with water use, particularly in the West, not just Colorado, but how precious of a resource that is, and finding ways to innovate and work together is critical to that nexus. As to the latter part of your question as to how you make that last, I do think, we've been talking about water, at least in the oil and gas perspective, for a long, long time in Colorado. I feel like I spend more of my time on air now, and we're not going to get into that today at all, but I think there are more conversations that need to be had, and there's more innovation that needs to be had. But I think it's also important that we talk about the success stories that we have. I know Seth was talking about the volume of water used in fracking and did a great job of sort of putting that into perspective. But it's also important to note, how much of that can be recycled and how much of that can be reused, and what some of those efforts are. So I'll leave that there and hope that I kind of answered your question.
Oh, you certainly did. And actually, Tom, if you want to stay visible for the sake of the panel discussion, okay, so I would like to have a vote from the panelists. Do you agree with me that public awareness is improving on how important energy and water, how important they are to the well-being that many people have taken for granted for a long time? Would you agree with me that that is getting better? So all who would agree with me, and I don't know that I'm right or wrong, so your vote is completely open here. So how many would say, yes, I have observed an improvement in public awareness on both these issues? And then of course you get to vote no. Okay. So anybody want to vote yes? Okay, we'll do the excellent unit of the thumb. And I'm assuming we'll have it that Seth may be voting both ways, because he remarked on how polarized this issue is, which I suppose a polarized, oppositional, antagonistic awareness is still an awareness.
Actually, I wasn't necessarily voting against, more saying I'm not really sure. I don't have good data, I guess, to go back to that again. But my gut feeling is, yeah, I think it is improving, but I can't say that with a great certainty.
Nor can I. So Tom, I think you were not voting for improving for the.
My perception is the awareness of water conservation stewardship has increased tremendously in the last 10, 15 years. And I think the same with energy. I was going to make a note that through crisis comes awareness, because back 15 years ago, we had the well shut down in South Platte Basin. And I got to tell you, you go to a restaurant and folks that were retired would come up to me and ask, now tell me about the intricacies of an augmentation plan and stream depletion factors and the historic consumptive use of sugar beets. Yeah. And I'm going, whoa, because 10 years prior to that, that was not a topic of conversation. So crisis, I think, brings out the increased awareness.
Right. This question did not appear in your list, but in the other sessions, we have thought to ourselves, to what degree is the pandemic a game changer on this? Is there any room left in public concern and commitment for matters that are not about the virus? And I understand you're all out of your area of nobody's got any data really on this one. So Seth, we're all just in the soup here with you. None of us know what we're talking about. So just a really quick round on this. To what degree do you think the pandemic either gives better opportunities for public engagement or just says probably not for a while until the vaccine is in place? Quick thoughts on that? Yeah, please, Tracy.
Well, one thing that I think we know is true is that the visitation to our state parks and other wilderness areas is way up during the pandemic. And I think one thing that can really do is bring to the forefront of people's minds Colorado's natural environment and our waters. A lot of the recreation that's going on has been focused around water and our state's lakes. And so, I don't know that it's highlighting much related to the energy industry, but I think people are definitely appreciating our natural environment and our water, and we're all potentially also paying more attention to wildfires that are going on right now. And one of the impacts of climate change is likely more damaging wildfires, and these things can all really be linked together: our natural environment, climate change, and a heightened awareness. I think of that is happening in Colorado right now.
On behalf of, sorry, Tom, Tom, you're muted. Do you want to speak?
Well, I was going to let Christy go. I was going to say, we know our Amazon delivery guy by first name now. I think that's a bad thing in terms of increased energy use.
Yeah, Christy.
Yeah, I can comment on the COVID issues too, but I wanted to go back to your other question about whether there is a public awareness and an increased public awareness. And I will own that I live in a bubble and see sort of the same people all the time and deal with a lot of misinformation that's also being spread throughout. And so that's something I think that's really a tough challenge for all of us to bring this sort of science to the table and conversation when you're constantly trying to prove a negative. And that's a real struggle. And so I don't necessarily see that improving. I think there's a lot of folks, particularly in the DJ Basin and the Front Range, talking to mothers in libraries about their air quality and their public health and groundwater issues and water contamination issues. And it's just simply not honest information. And so I think that's something that we're going to have to combat for many years to come. As it pertains to the COVID-19 crisis, I think we're going to see something very interesting happen, not only in Colorado, but nationally on the energy level. And I think that's going to come down to economic recovery. I think it's going to be really important to see where our resources come from and how they're put together. One of the things that I feel most passionately about in Colorado is that we really do use our natural resources that are at our fingertips to truly produce sustainable energy. And that includes solar power, that includes energy, it includes the natural gas, oil and natural gas we produce in our backyard. And I think to Tom's point about your Amazon delivery person, it's partly about pollution prevention, but true sustainability means farm to table energy, right? That you're producing something where you live. And we do that here. We do that really well. We do it under the most stringent environmental regulations of the state. And I think that's something we should be proud of, but I think it's also something we need to leverage to teach people both in other states and nationally about, and I think it's going to be a big part, the balance of our energy in the state. And I think that water consumption as applies to that will be a big part of how we recover from the economic issues with this pandemic.
I told all the panelists that I think that the world could certainly profit from us modeling civil disagreement. So if anybody disagrees with anything that anybody said, I know you folks now, and I know you will do it with great grace and raise the spirits of your fellow citizens when you do it in that spirit. So just to mention that if anybody wants to take up anything that anybody said, by all means do that. So yeah, Seth, you were waiting to talk.
Sure. Yeah, just to build on this idle speculation, provide my own idle speculation regarding the impacts of COVID-19. I think it sounds like Christy actually has more solid information perhaps, but I certainly don't, but I would say, I guess mostly building from what Tracy said, yeah, I think a lot of us have shifted our lives and our priorities and where we're doing things and how we're doing them. And within that, a lot of things have become quite a lot more hands-on and more direct. You know, for example, I'm at home using my air conditioning more than I would otherwise. So I'm seeing my electricity bill go up. You know, just as easily people could be using more water, possibly noticing those numbers trickling upward. Again, as Tracy said, folks are using the parks a lot more. Folks are doing a lot more vacations by car rather than by plane. With the car, you got to fill the tank yourself, assuming it has a gas tank. And, you know, with an airplane, it's pretty easy just to jump on there, end up somewhere else. You didn't really notice the fuel being burned, even though it was quite a lot of it. Similar things are happening with water. So I think a lot of us are having more of a local and, you know, hands-on focus on a lot of these things. So I would suspect that COVID-19 might result in greater awareness and more direct awareness, which for many people is how they learn things, through the hands-on experience.
So I'm going to also say for the panelists that you were given early communications about how we were hoping for optimism and a sense of where things are working and so on. But the times are quite well supplied with not so inspirational indications of how we behave as a nation and as citizens and so on. If anyone wants to go into that, in the framework of a couple more questions that I want us to shift to here, of for you, what issues, decisions, challenges in your area of expertise carry the greatest sense of urgency? What in your area, if you work quite a bit in both areas, by all means stay in that zone, but you can go into specialization here and just say, where is the greatest urgency, and does that urgency compel us to bring these two areas together in some way? So is that got that? Where in your fields are you seeing the greatest challenges with the greatest sense of urgency, and how would the energy-water collaboration get called into being by that urgency? And if you want to say something dark and depressing now, you can. You are licensed to go into a moment where people said, we thought this was supposed to be cheery and now it's not. We'll get back to being cheery, but you can go into the darkness now if you like. I don't know who would want to take that on, for heaven's sake. So yeah, Tracy, you're there.
Yeah, thank you, Patty. You know, in terms of Colorado's water and thinking about our future, one issue that water planners talk about a lot is the fact that our population is growing, like Tom alluded to before. Our population in Colorado is growing, and with that we need to determine, well, where are we going to get water to supply all these people who are going to be increasing the population of Colorado. And like Seth showed earlier, most of our water is currently used in the agricultural sector. Something like 85 or 87% of the water diverted in Colorado is diverted to supply the agricultural sector. And so what's likely to happen is that a lot of that water from the agricultural sector is going to get changed over so that it can be used in the municipal water supply sector. And one of the outcomes of that changeover, when you convert water from agricultural irrigation to municipal use, can be an impact on our rural economies and our agricultural way of life in rural Colorado. And that's a problem that state water planners and a lot of people in the water industry are quite aware of, and it's at the front of their mind. And so one of the things a lot of water people are looking at is, well, how can we obtain water for municipal and other uses like energy uses without having those big impacts on our rural economies, where if you stop farming, then not only do you lose the farm income, you may also lose, the coffee shop, and you may lose that agricultural vista. How can we avoid a lot of those losses?
Right.
And one of the things that water planners are looking at is just, creative solutions where maybe we have changes of water right from irrigation to other uses like municipal and irrigation, where that change only happens in certain dry years, for instance, or occurs on a rotational basis where you have a large farm where you're going to dry up one field in one particular year and then a different field the next year. And so you're going to rotate around your agricultural dry up, but you're never going to dry up this entire farm. And so we're seeing creative solutions like that to supply not only the municipal industry, but I've also seen those kind of solutions used by energy companies in terms of finding creative ways to source water for their projects that minimize the impacts to, other things that are really important to Coloradans. So I'm pretty encouraged by seeing some of the creative thinking from the energy industry. And so that's,
I worry that you might have forgotten your role as a wet blanket there for a moment.
right, yeah.
So that's okay. We don't need to do that.
I'll come back to that later.
There's a tiny chance that I may be losing internet connection. So if I'm gone for a minute or two, Talia will step in and take over for me. But I think I'm going to be okay. I don't know. We'll find.
And with that, there she went. I actually don't have Patty's list of questions in front of me. So while we wait for her to come back, I will pull one from the chat, or I guess I will open up a topic of discussion that I've seen a lot of people talking about in the chat, which is water reclamation. We have several people wondering things like, can gray water from urban buildings be reclaimed? Can wastewater from agricultural use be reclaimed? And then there was also a question, I'm scrolling a little bit up, so if you can see me looking away, that's why. Wastewater produced by oil and gas development. Is there a way to make that water, any of that water, usable at a reasonable cost is one really important point that was emphasized a few times. What do you all have to say about that? I know all of us maybe have perspectives that would touch on that a little bit, so I'll leave that one open for our panelists. And remember to unmute yourself. I see maybe a couple people starting to jump in.
In terms of produced water, when I was at the water district in Greeley, we were offered produced water that originated north of Fort Collins, and they used to be closer to Greeley, so transportation was a big issue. But our biggest concern was water quality. And I'm curious, Seth, the quality of produced water generally, a perception we all had at our water district was there could be things in that water that would not be good to use in agriculture. That's a perception, not a fact.
Well, I should start off by saying that I'm definitely not a geochemist. I do hang out with them a fair amount, but beyond, yeah, maybe I wouldn't necessarily want to drink it myself. I can't offer a whole lot. I'm guessing Christy may have more to say about this and a lot more specifics on what it takes to treat and reuse these waters. So I'd be curious to hear her perspective on that one.
I'm happy to jump in. I think produced water tends to be really saline and really, really high TDS concentrations. You add to that the potential, and it's not always there, but a potential for high metals concentrations, arsenic, etc. And the treatment train of that water all of a sudden becomes very, very cost prohibitive. And so you can use it for other things like fracking again with a minimum amount of treatment. But to get it to a level where you could use it for agricultural or any kind of reuse related to consumption would be really problematic. And I think that also comes from the depths with which it's injected and withdrawn. It just becomes really, really poor quality water really quickly, which is the struggle. There are ways to do it, but not cost effectively.
Tracy, any addition there before we hand it back to Patty?
Thank you, I'm back.
Yeah, this would be a good opportunity also for me to be a wet blanket in terms of saying that that's one of this question about reuse gets into one of those difficulties about our system of water rights, where well permits and water rights are often very specific about what they might be used for. And typically the uses are only for the first use. I'll just say typically because there is nothing that is one size fits all in water law. There are certain types of water, like transbasin water, that maybe it came from the Colorado River Basin over to the South Platte Basin, that may be reused. So used the first time and then reused. Or non-tributary water that comes from a very deep aquifer, where pumping that water doesn't have any impact on the flow of water in streams. That type of water can also be reused. But many types of water cannot be reused because of the allowances of the court decree for that water. So that can be a prohibition as well.
Okay. Thank you all for those comments. I'll hand it back to Patty momentarily, but there are a couple questions that came in that we will answer in just a few, or that we can dig into a little bit.
Could I jump in on that question, actually?
Absolutely, Seth. Yeah.
Please. So to maybe provide a little backstory on some of what Christy said regarding all the stuff that might be in oil and gas produced waters, which has quite a lot of bearing on the legalities that Tracy just mentioned. So, and I bring this up mostly because it's a piece I certainly wouldn't have been aware of other than having looked at this stuff a bit. So a lot of the water that's getting produced is old seawater. Like these sediments in these basins were deposited in, you know, whatever version of ocean, conceivably, sometimes lake basins over millennia. And, you know, the sediments get deposited, there's seawater in there over time that, you know, the rocks get, you know, the sediments get compressed into rocks. The seawater is still sitting there. It's not like it all got flushed away. There is some inherent water flow, but over time, these things just become a lot more saline because the water molecules exit more easily than the salt and other weird things like the, you know, whatever, arsenic, selenium, that kind of thing. So a lot of the produced water that comes from the formation where the oil and gas reside, that water is essentially old seawater, and it's going to be what old seawater is, which is kind of old and salty and gross, and you probably don't want to drink it. With that, there's also water that may have been injected for hydraulic fracturing, depending on the vintage of well and whether it was fracked and whatever. You know, there's also water injected that has its own set of chemicals in it, and those two may have their issues, but it's two separate parts. And I want to just point out the reason for there being the selenium and salt that Christy mentioned, because it's something I might not have been aware of.
Okay. Well, thank you all for that. Any last points before I hand it back to Patty?
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry, I did disappear in the digital world for a minute or two there. Thank you all for carrying on it so well. In fact, when I came back, I thought, turns out I wasn't totally necessary here, but I'm going to proceed as if I were. So I have just a couple of last questions before we turn to the audience. And I do want to say, while on that subject I just came in on, that I have really been taken with the work of people like Zahi Kath at School of Mines, and they say we can get that water with all the gunk that you just described, Seth, we can get that to potable if you want to put the money in. So that's one of those things. It's not just this is fate and destiny. It's just what do we want to put money into? And I believe that those engineers who are working on water treatment really could go very far. But is that an expense that industry wants to pay? Maybe not. Is it an expense that the public works projects want to pay? I don't know. So I want to say that. And now I want to ask you the question about if you have a story from your own experience when you were collaborating with people in the other area of expertise. Was there a time when you were working away in your field of expertise and you realized that you needed to arrange a consultation with an expert in that other field, presuming the two fields are water and energy? Or maybe just a social event where you were chatting with somebody and you thought, well, now that's interesting. This person is dealing with some of the same challenges. I would certainly think that the fact that when you put infrastructure in place, time is going to move along, and the maintenance of that infrastructure, the upkeep of that, the people who all attended the dedication ceremony or the congratulations won't be thinking about how much the obligation to maintain and tend to. So I'm just going to see if somebody wants to go into that direction with the story, but I have made it much more open-ended. So So here's the testimony to when you were working away and you thought, I need somebody from that other team. Okay, yes, so Christy, you seem to be ready to go.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in my industry, it's something I do all the time, both internally and externally. The science that goes into the production of oil and gas is significant, and I talk daily with petroleum engineers, air quality specialists, radiation specialists, you name it. And I have a degree in environmental engineering, which is somewhat broad and some broad experience. But then you also get into things like land use, where we're literally working on rules right now for noise and lighting in urban areas, traffic, dust management. And so internally, we do that all the time, but externally we do as well. You know, we sit at the table with environmental organizations, local governments, concerned citizens. And it's really, really important, I think, in stakeholder discussions. I think someone from the Duke School of Public Policy once explained it to me like a sundial. If you have stakeholders all on the outside and a facilitator in the middle, I think it's easy for us all as stakeholders to think about ourselves being in the middle and how everyone else's opinions sort of impact or affect what we're doing. And there's a big fallacy in that. I think it's really, really important to put yourself in each other piece of the clock or sundial so that you can really get a perspective of another person in a scientific way and outside of a scientific way, just so that you can really find that common ground and find that middle solution. And so I offer that as sort of a perspective that I think we all need to think about when we're reaching across borders, be them scientific borders or not.
Anyone else with a story? I've got a minute or two. I'm wondering, please go ahead.
My story's in a hockey locker room in Greeley. And so we're learning to play ice hockey, and I'm sitting next to a guy that works for a public service, and he talked about this new agreement with the Fort Morgan Ditch and Reservoir Company to provide water for the Pawnee Power Plant. And I went, huh, I never heard of something like that. And Tracy, you probably know way more about that than I do, but the use of agriculture water that's gone through a change of use for power plant cooling. I thought that was intriguing.
We are coming close to the limit of our time for this section. I do want to go back to, because it is a historian's question about longer range thinking. Once we have dams in place, once we have a producing oil and gas field, it certainly seems like the long-term monitoring of subsurface pipelines and flow lines and wells and so on, that has been a series. Well, obviously Firestone would be one case of that, but just once it is in place and we have said, well, there it is, it's in place, the longer range thinking. As a historian, I have found that when you were going into interdisciplinary land with the biologists, you don't say you should pay attention to history, you say you should pay attention to anthropogenic change, because that is the language they speak. With the engineers, you say, oh, not history, but durability. You should join me in a conversation on durability. So I just as an historian wanted to sort of make sure that we got that in there about how much both of these areas of resource supply require us in ways that we don't always rise to as a society to say what happens 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now. So is there anyone who is exemplary on the panel in thinking in those longer units of issues of durability? Is there anyone who tries and recognizes how hard it is? Or anyone want to speak to this issue of thinking longer term? Well, that's because I was so eloquent in my remarks that nobody needs to do it. But it does seem like a place where our attention has to go, because it is so fundamentally about our relationship to posterity, which most of these issues in one way or another go back to. So, okay, so it is now precisely 11 o'clock and we're totally on time. Is there anything, we'll just take one more moment. Is there anything that somebody was just yearning to say in this question and answer period that they didn't get to? Do you want 30 seconds to get that in now, individually? 30 seconds. You're totally content. You don't see a lot of that these days, so it's good to do that. So, okay, You're on.
All right, well then I guess it means it is my turn. So at this point, folks, I'm going to be pulling questions from the chat. So these are our questions and wonderings that our audience have submitted. If there's something that you're wondering about and you haven't typed it in the chat yet, please feel free to do so at any point. I apologize if we can't get to every single question. We will certainly try. And what you'll probably see me doing is that I'm going to be mushing some similar questions together because there are some themes that have emerged from our questions today. So maybe your exact question won't be answered, but something related to it will be. All right, so one theme that I've seen emerge is the theme of growth. Questions about, the population's going to continue to grow, development's going to continue to grow, and with that, so is our need for things like oil and gas development, water use, not only for municipal purposes, but also for agricultural purposes. How is that being accounted for? So both in the development of oil and gas wells and drilling, in the reclamation of things like wastewater for potential use, as Patty said, that's challenging, but it is possible if we want to divert funding. Just how are we accounting for potential growth in the coming decades? And I guess I didn't direct this at anyone, but yeah, Tracy, maybe you want to start?
Talia. And I think what I'd like to do is take that as a bit of a setup for your panel on Thursday, where Russ Sands, who's on staff for the Colorado Water Conservation Board, is going to be part of the panel. I don't want to totally kick the can down the road because maybe whoever asked that, can't attend on Thursday. But in terms of planning for Colorado's water future and looking at what our potential futures are, the Colorado Water Conservation Board has developed Colorado's water plan and is in a continual process of updating it based on new data and science. And what they look at is things like population projections and projections for the needs for different industries, like the energy industry, 50 years out into the future. And they have a pretty cool way of looking at it. Maybe it's similar to something Lorna Katz from Denver Water talked about, the way they plan for the future, where you don't just plan for one scenario, you look at different scenarios for the future. Like there's a scenario in Colorado's water plan called hot growth, where not only do we have a hot future, but we also have a lot of population growth. And so of course that puts a lot of stress on our water. And so with that, you can project what the future water demands are and then try to think up some solutions for at least where supplies of water might come from. And I certainly mentioned one earlier, which is currently most of our water is used for agricultural purposes, and that water can be changed to other purposes by looking at the way it was historically used. And what that's going to do is just, take water from our rural parts of Colorado where it's used to grow crops, and then it can be used to supply our growing cities. So, that's definitely one solution for our future water supply. And with that, at least the state is quite mindful about the implications of drying up farms in rural Colorado, and how can we look to minimize impacts on rural Colorado when we do take water away and use it for other uses. And I guess I just need to add too that maybe the way I spoke about it sounded like the state would make decisions about actually taking water from one use to supply another use, and that's not what I mean. Water rights are a property right, and so farmers are able to sell their water right if they want to, but nobody's going to force that to happen.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Is anyone interested in adding anything on to that?
I just ask a question actually of Tracy. So the part of it that has always jumped out at me is, ag's using a huge amount of water. Is there a way that they could use less water, that user group could use less water without overly impacting the way of life? I don't think any of us want to tell the farmers to stop being farmers, and I think we all like to eat, or I certainly do. Is it like if there was a small level of economization on water use, slightly different drippers, slightly different strategies in watering? I'm not sure exactly which crops are grown, or somewhere in the mix, if there could even be like a 0.5% savings of water, that would make a huge difference relative to municipal use, but would it have to make a huge difference relative to the way of life and the issues that you talked about, which I think we would all agree are pretty important?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Seth, because certainly certain ways of irrigating are, we would say, more efficient than others. People have probably driven around the state and seen flood irrigation and also seen sprinklers, and we're probably all familiar with drip irrigation, which would be the most efficient, meaning that upwards of 90% of the water that you're going to put through your drip irrigation system is actually going to be consumed by the crop, versus having a lot of the water actually maybe run off a field and not be consumed by the plants. And so that flood irrigation is a less efficient way of using water. And people ask about those more efficient methods of irrigating, and it's true that that would result in less diversion of water to irrigate the same field if you have a more efficient method. But one thing that is not always, that people aren't always aware of, is that unused water from flood irrigation, it returns to the stream system, and sometimes it returns with a delayed effect because it might percolate through the groundwater and then slowly make its way back to the stream system. That water actually ends up being diverted downstream by other water users. And so in a way, some of that inefficiency is just a way of returning water back to the system for use by others, and maybe changing the timing. And so, there's implications of improving our efficiency in irrigation that might actually affect other water users' ability to also use the water for other uses. So it's not a silver bullet, I guess, is all that I'm saying, that there could be benefits of reducing those diversions, but there would also be other implications for downstream water users that we'd want to be aware of.
So I just would like to add to that, because it was a student who brought my attention to this. I was such a fan of the idea of ditch liners in agriculture. I just thought, yes, why would you not do that? But exactly the point that you're making, that in fact, that interrupts recharge. That really is quite a disruptive idea. So here I just thought, oh, the agricultural problem is so easily solved by ditch liners, and then it turned out, pretty complicated, partly for the downstream users, but also just for the ecosystem and for the creatures that might depend on that. So that to me was one of the great places of saying, this is more complicated than I want it to be, and have to live with that. So
and this is really an important topic, because there was a study of return flows along the South Platte River done back in the 1880s or 1890s, because the early settlers realized that the South Platte River dried up when it got past Fort Morgan. And so if you look at the water right dates downstream in Fort Morgan, and Tracy, I don't know the exact dates, but direct flow diversions downstream of Sterling, let's say, I believe are 1890s or so. You get up to the canyons up by Boulder or Longmont or Loveland, you're talking early 1860s. So the river grew through those return flows over the 1880s, 1890s, because of exactly what you're both talking about, this return flow of the surface water diversions. When you go to drip irrigation, you totally change that, and you're not legally able to sell off your saved water, your salvaged water under today's water law. You can change your cropping pattern, but if you got to pay your bills on your land and your all your mortgages, and your kids are going to college, you're not going to switch from a high dollar crop to a low dollar crop to conserve water, because you go bankrupt. And that's a generalization, but that's what you hear often when you talk to irrigators about, why don't you change crops and use less water? Well, it's about cash flow and income. And it gets all tangled up after that.
It does. I would like to come back to this issue in a second with a couple of other questions, but for now, I do want to keep us moving forward so we have time to get to as many as possible. I do see a couple of questions, and Seth, maybe this is one for you, asking for just a broad summary of the intersection of water and hydraulic fracturing. So what's the use of water and hydraulic fracturing, as well as some of the potential issues, benefits? Can you give us more of an overview of that particular issue?
That's a monster question, or a conglomeration of questions. Let's see, I guess, what would I say? Well, I mean, certainly, hydraulic fracturing water use is up substantially in the last 15 years, 20 years. Hydraulic fracturing has been around since the 40s or something in various forms. The basic concept being you blast some high pressure water down the well and you cause the rock to fracture. And that's pretty good for helping fluids to flow, including the oil and gas that you're trying to produce. And that's been used, like I said, for ages and increased a lot in recent years as technologies have improved and it's become more possible to extract oil and gas from rocks that were previously considered to be only source rock, that is where the oil and gas got created, or otherwise rock that wasn't going to be, the flow properties weren't sufficient for getting anything out of, at least not at economic speeds. So the use is up. There are pluses and minuses on the US producing a lot more oil and gas than we used to. Some of those are geopolitical and broadly economic. I think it's maybe better not to even try to go into them at this moment, but hopefully folks are aware that there are positives to that. There are also possible negatives. Let's see, there's water. The water comes back out of the ground, as I talked about. A lot of the hydraulic fracturing water does not come out of the ground, strangely. If you look at the geochemistry, it turns out that quite a lot of water produced with oil and gas is actually the formation water, that old seawater that's been sitting in the formation for millennia, rather than the hydraulic fracturing water. There tends to be a lot of concern regarding hydraulic fracturing leading to contamination of aquifers. Certainly well placed, intuitively, that seems like maybe a problem. However, I would suggest, and not even suggest, I will state that as far as I'm aware, the science has not unveiled any cases of hydraulic fracturing directly impacting groundwater. That there are examples of gas percolating up through improperly sealed boreholes. That does suggest a pathway. However, in terms of hydraulic fracturing directly, like fracturing these fluids into aquifers, they're very far apart depth-wise, and the operator doesn't want to do that. The operator being the oil and gas company. Like, the whole point is to extract oil and gas, not to extract water from the aquifer. So if you fracture somehow into an aquifer, you're going to be producing water, not oil and gas. And water is worth a lot, but not as much as oil and gas. So that's certainly a concern. It's something to keep monitoring, keep an eye out for. But I think that level of concern has been kind of blown out of proportion in some cases. Water use is obviously an issue. The total volumes, I just showed the numbers where, yeah, it's a big number. It might be a big deal in some counties where, water supplies are tight or whatever. At the same time, relative to other major water user groups, it's not a lot. So I think it's more of an issue to be aware of in terms of transportation, local use. If we can get better ways or better incentives to be reusing the produced water for hydraulic fracturing, technology and transportation are part of that. That's a big area for improvement. That was a long, rambly answer. Others on the panel may have things to say, either things I totally missed or different perspectives. So I'd be curious to hear what other panelists might say about that too.
Yeah, thank you for taking that on. I recognize that was a big question, but I think a couple of folks watching today were saying I could really use a little bit more of a broad level summary. Are there any responses to that point? Otherwise, I do have another question that I would like to hear from everybody on just a little bit.
I just have a quick response in that, Steph, I think you did a great job, and I would support what you said 100%.
Okay, well, with that, I may be opening a Pandora's box here. I recognize that going in, but there are a lot of questions in the chat alluding to things like consumer choice and consumer behavior potentially being a driver for water conservation, energy conservation behaviors. Some people saying things like, well, if we can put pressure with market value on farmers to produce crops that maybe are considered that low dollar crop but use less water, could that push them to divert? Or how much water is actually diverted to growing things like feed for meat production rather than to actually watering crops? And one person has come out with the hard-hitting question, well, shouldn't we all be vegetarians? So what do you all make of things like consumer pressure and some of those questions around consumer choice and consumer decision-making as drivers of water and energy consumption? That's a big one. Yeah, go for it, Christy, if you have something to start off with.
I think that that's really critical. I think as an environmentalist myself and someone who does believe firmly in sustainability, where you spend your dollar down to every quarter makes 100% of the difference. You know, all of the things that we're talking about are consumer driven. It's important with that caveat to understand that there is a balance that needs to happen. One of the questions earlier was around how we're planning for population growth in Colorado from an energy perspective, and we talked about it from a water perspective, but I think, there's a lot of new rules and legislation being put on the books to convert to a carbon-free future. And while I recognize that fossil fuels lead to climate change, and I think that climate change is real, I think we also have to consider economic poverty really importantly. And I think that, again, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about sustainability and farm to table energy and water use, quite frankly. I think you have to balance those two things, but I think 100% where you spend your money makes a big difference in terms of how you influence environmental choices.
Yeah, interesting point. So how we spend our dollars can be a big driver for moving some of these things forward. Other panelists, anything to add to that?
I guess I'm transformed into a panelist. Back to another student, a student here. So you did a very interesting senior thesis on how, in fact, you don't really control behavior by modifying water prices. And sometimes, yes, but first of all, water is so cheap, comparatively speaking, but this wonderful young woman, Chelsea, just did this great project where we all thought her results would be, yes, you can use price as the signal that changes people's conduct. No, because people are too complicated. And this notion that we have we have neuroeconomists who are looking at how this strange world of the human mind shapes our conduct and our behavior in ways that are not purely, let's look at our home budget and see how that's working out. So I'm wondering if we have ever really used those neuroeconomists sufficiently in thinking about water and consumers and energy and consumers, because they really scramble the usual predictable, if we change the prices this way, we can expect X or Y. And I haven't followed it. I'm assuming that those people are all desperate to publish to get tenure, so they're all writing those studies somewhere. So I might try to find them.
So when I give a talk, I'd love to ask people, where did you grow up? And so how many of you grew up in Colorado? Well, I didn't. One out of 6. So if the other 5 of us would go back home where we came from, we would not have a water problem in Colorado or an energy problem. If someone tells me to go back home, am I going to do it? No. Why would I do that? Who would give someone the right to tell me what to do where I live? When you start talking to farmers about what they ought to grow or eat or whatever, you kind of get the same reaction as if someone told you to go back home from a place there was a paper, Buffalo Commons. This is 30 years ago. People should not live. The couple was from Rutgers University, I believe. People should not live in a place where buffalo used to roam because there's not enough water. There's not enough resources. Ought to go back home. It makes sense, but no one would ever do it. But the point was, we're living in places that are not sustainable without lots of anthropogenic changes. And that's what causes the trouble with our environment and so forth.
That reminds me of, if I can add an editorial point for a moment, a fire ecologist I know has said, wildfire is not the problem. It's that people live where wildfires happen. That's the problem. So that's an interesting point. And I'm not trying to push any agenda by saying that, that's just an interesting perspective here. Christy, I saw you begin to raise your hand.
I was just going to add a point of brevity to Patty's comment about her student's paper and just say that he probably has never talked to my dad about his water bill because I got told a lot as a child to conserve water, conserve energy, but I was just all kidding aside.
I like it though. That's a good perspective too. The dads of society saying, don't touch that thermostat. Could that be the solution that we really need? I don't know, something to think about. Any other responses to questions about consumer choice?
Well, now that said, consumer choice, we've got to increase awareness to get consumers to change behavior. I mean, we can, and how do we do that? That's the big question. I don't know.
I just jump in there to say that those of us who are educators always get to the edge of deep melancholy when in policy discussions, people who don't teach students will say, well, the solution is education. And you think, try it, just try it. And education is incredibly joyful to participate in, but the notion that you put stuff before receptive young people and they say, oh, thank you, we'll just take that to heart. Not so much. And so that word education, I think, Tony, you must have, well, that's where you live and operate, but very cheerful things can be said about consumer education, which causes us to think, okay, if you figure out some tricks, tell us, because we've been in the business a long time. And with the consent, the best thing I ever heard on this, I always have to quote this, I usually do not go anywhere near borrowing Indian people's wisdom, but this was a Yakima woman who teaches young kiddos the Yakima language. And she was at a meeting I was at, and just as if we would all, as if there was no point in saying this, because we would all understand that, she said to us, I never work with a child, a Yakima child, until I have said, do I have your permission to teach you? So when she said that, I thought, well, that would explain a lot of my problems in life. I have forgotten to ask that question, but certainly with a public audience, do I have your permission to educate you? It's an important place to begin. And if you jump over that, all kinds of wacky things can happen. So sorry, just the educator yammering along there, which is part of why we don't do so well in classes, because we yammer the students out through now.
Yeah, that's a good point. As someone with also an education background, yeah, it's not as simple as bring the horse to water. I've seen some other comments and questions come in about things like mandates. So this seems like a good potential place to shift over to that. And I do want to acknowledge we have about 7 minutes left. If we go a couple minutes over, that's fine, but we don't want to go too far past 11:30. I did see some questions come in earlier about things like mandating that farmers reduce their particular water use, or that utilities or hydraulic fracturing or some of the other, industry groups reduce or are able to reclaim a certain amount of their water, or even things like mandating that citizens use their water, their energy, whatever else in a particular way. What do you all think of the idea of mandating some of these changes? Is that a viable solution forward, or is that a recipe for disaster? And Thomas, maybe we'll start with you, because you had a few things to say about, if you tell a farmer you have to plant this, is the farmer going to do that?
Human behavior is just fascinating. Wear a mask so people don't get sick from you. I mean, there it is in a nutshell. Now, if you go to France, I think they fine you thousands of euros if you don't caught not wearing a mask in public. So without fines, human nature is really intriguing, to where many people do not want someone telling them what to do for whatever reason. So human nature is a really intricate and touchy and thorny thing to work with and get around, or work with.
Yeah, that it's a tough nut to crack there. Who else has something to say about that? Tracy, we haven't heard from you in a little while. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess when I hear you mention mandate, to me that just means you're looking for a change to the law that requires people to do something. And I've been working in Colorado legislation for a couple years now related to water, and I can say for sure that water legislation takes a lot of time. It requires a lot of work with a lot of stakeholders to bring people together so that they can agree on the same legislation. And that would be for what a lot of the public would imagine is a relatively minor change to the law related to water. And so, when I think about mandates for water usage, I think that would be a major change. If you were going to try to mandate a reduction in water use by farmers, it sounds like you'd be affecting what is a property right. So that would be a pretty difficult thing. And so I guess the bottom line to answer that question is, I think such a mandate, the passage of such a mandate through the Colorado legislature would be a really steep hill to climb up.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue for sure. And I think that's
Thank
why I wanted you to hear or I wanted to hear your perspective. Seth, did I see you start to unmute?
Yeah, I guess just to sort of chime in on the broader points in this conversation, definitely I would 100% agree with what Thomas said regarding human behavior being an interesting thing to observe. And I would just add that, you know, there are various ways to try to encourage things to happen. And we've talked about regulation of just saying it's got to be this way. And we talked about fines, such as, you know, which basically amounts to penalizing poor behavior. But there are also ways in which sometimes desired behavior can be incentivized. And I don't have any great answers on how that works in this case, but that's another way to try to get things to happen. And I would suggest that in terms of, you know, that can be the most effective option if you can find a good way to do it. So in terms of getting folks to use less water, not sure where the answer is exactly, but perhaps it's somewhere in that realm.
I would say that one thing that is ridiculous in how well it works, sometimes with students, but with the public, is to compliment them on how well they're doing something. And I have used that, now it's being exposed to the public, but if there's an agency, state, local, federal agency, and they are sort of just getting started on something I think is a very positive trend, I will sometimes compliment them for doing it so well. And at that point, it is hard for anybody to say, actually, don't compliment us, we're not doing that at all. And so I would say there's an interesting way of celebrating, even if it's a very incremental, very partial change, but to really go into full cheerleader mode for how well that's being done. That makes it very hard for people just to say, well, no, don't say these nice things about us. We're really not helping at all. So anyway, I just think that's a manipulation we should all use more often, is taking incremental improvement and becoming exhilarated by it and thanking people beyond what they deserve.
As a former teacher of small children, or I guess occasionally still current teacher, I can say that works in kindergartners too. You're doing such a good job of sitting there crisscross applesauce. Tracy, I saw you start to raise your hand, and Christy, we haven't heard from you on this one yet, and then we're almost at time. So Tracy, let's go to you first.
Okay, so great, thank you. Just really briefly, since I feel like my last answer was pretty negative, I do want to counter that with, I've seen some real positives out of the state legislature in terms of a willingness to try things and see how well they might work. And so there have been a few bills that have passed in the last decade that allows us to try different things with water on sort of a pilot project approach where, you know, let's allow 10 projects of this sort and let's see how it works. Some of those things are related to efficiency and some are related to those alternative transfer method type of projects. And so one way that has worked well to try things out and allow people to gain comfort in these changes is pilot projects.
That's a great point too. Got to try some new stuff. Christy, anything to wrap it up and bring us home with this one?
I'll try to be brief. You know, human behavior is interesting and mandates are tough. I think we've seen a lot of that in the United States' response to COVID and our sort of inability to adjust our way of life. However, we have adjusted our way of life, and I'm interested to see some of the science that's going to come out of that in terms of what our impacts are on the environment and air quality. Mandating, you know, for example, driving your personal vehicle versus carpooling is something we talk a lot with the Air Quality Control Commission, Air Pollution Control Division here in Colorado, when we're talking about air quality and ozone discussions. And you know, it's a touchy subject with American people. You know, it's really hard to say, thou shalt not. And so then the second piece, I think, is the incentivizing different solutions. I think, you know, representing the oil and gas industry is something I'm really proud of because we are incredibly innovative. You know, we've lowered our emissions by almost 50% in the last 10 years, all through creative engineering. The West Slope, I know, the Piance Basin recycles a ton of water. Some operators up to 80%. There's some interesting projects in Wyoming where they're reclaiming water and discharging it to streams and actually having to add minerals back in. And I think the drivers for that often are cumulative. I think the reduction in truck traffic is a financial thing you have to look at. Wildlife improvements is something you have to look at. I think looking at it from purely an energy perspective and purely a water perspective would fall short of understanding the true impacts and ways to incentivize improved technology in that arena. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. I think a summary for our time together today is that it is complicated. All of these things, you know, we all want a clear path forward, and there's just not necessarily a clear path forward because every option has, you know, some downsides and some good to it. And that's why we need to have conversations like this one so that we can try and figure out what the best path forward. Maybe it's not perfect, but, you know, what can we do? Patty, any last words before we wrap up?
I thought this was just a great group of people, and which has been true on the previous sessions as well. And Bob Reynolds deserves a huge round of applause for his recruitment on this. But that exchange, well, that's Bob the Hoop. And really, panelists, how great. And my thought is always at this moment of, oh, why aren't we going to lunch to keep talking? What's wrong here? Or we can go, I mean, we'll all go to lunch, but it will be this sad, fragmented, dispersed lunch. So I'm going to say that as soon as we get to the other side of our troubles that keep us from meeting, that one of the things we must do is I guess we'll call it a reunion of these folks. And although that's getting very out of control, because now we also want all these great audience members with all their questions. So, so now we need major funding. So now we're back to, anyway, what a pleasure. And I so wish we could continue the conversation, and we will, all of us. I think Colorado Scientific Society might be thinking now about ways to continue this into the future, into 2021, because there certainly is a lot of energy and momentum and charm. I'm going to say charm among these panelists too. So, and I don't want to be optimistic about anything in our times that doesn't come with a lot of charm and persuasiveness. And this group really has that. So thank you.
Thank you all. We will see you next week for our final session of the Colorado Water and Energy Symposium. Same time, same Zoom link, 10 a.m. Mountain Time to 11:30 Mountain Time. We are really looking forward to next week. I think we're going to be talking a lot about population growth and its impacts on water and energy, including hearing from the state demographer. So if that's an interest of yours, make sure you tune in next week.
That's this Thursday. No, it's this Thursday.
This Thursday. That's right. I'm so sorry. You know what? Corona time, right? It's a little bit hard to know what day it is sometimes. So thanks, Bob. We will see you Thursday of this week, same time, same Zoom link for more conversations. Thank you all so much for being here. We'll see you next time, folks. Thank you to all of our panelists. You did a fabulous job, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.